Hi, everyone. I'm Alex Costa. I am a board member for the Idaho Apartment Association. I'm a regional property manager with Greystar Property Management. For those that don't know about Greystar, we're actually the largest property management company in the world, with just over 1 million units managed worldwide. We have 64 offices, 250 markets globally. But I also like to call out, I have done single family rentals here in the market. About 8 years ago, I actually managed some of StacyA's properties. So that's how we first met.
And you did a fine job at it.
The best job, Stacy, the best job. Well, the remote's not working. There we go. All right, the H word. I know everybody is excited to hear finally what this is. There's some of my contact info. There will be a little bit at the end too. If you have any specific questions that I can't answer for you today, then feel free to reach out to me. We are talking about hoarding. That is the H word, hoarding. So it is not just something you see on TV. For those that have had to deal with it, you understand how much of a problem it really can be. But what we really want to talk about is how hoarding, especially over the last 10 years or so, has made its way into fair housing and how it can impact you as a landlord and impact your residents. So I just covered most of this, but I have been in the industry for a little over 10 years. I currently oversee a portfolio of about 1,300 units, all apartments here in the Valley. And then I'm on my second term with the board of directors for the AVID Apartment Association. This is our menace of a puppy we just got right before Christmas. She's awesome, but also we forgot how hard raising a puppy is. So, and then our daughter and our other 10-year-old dog as well. All right, so talking hoarding, we wanted to cover just a couple of basics. So fair housing protected classes, I'll cover that just really quickly, but also how to manage hoarding, how the situation itself can impact how you manage hoarding, and then the differences between hoarding versus just unsanitary living conditions, and reasonable accommodations. Those are going to be some of the main pieces that we're covering. So for those that aren't aware, fair housing has the 7 main protected classes, and then depending state by state, there's a couple of others that may be added in. These are the primary ones that are federally recognized. And the one we're really going to focus on today is disability, just because it is one of the most challenging ones to understand how it can apply. And hoarding is actually considered a mental disability when it comes to true hoarding. So what is hoarding? The act of collecting and keeping a large number of items, often to the point of clutter. As most of us know, hoarding can create safety hazards, tripping hazards, structural damage, increased risk of disease, pest infestations, all the fun things. Hoarding can be considered a mental disorder, like I just mentioned, or a disability, and therefore that is where it becomes protected under the Fair Housing Act. For those that don't know, there was a TV show about hoarding and obsessive compulsive disorder, and it is a fascinating watch if you have not watched it. But you really see how it becomes more than just keeping items, and it really becomes a fixation for people, and something that most people aren't able to control when it is to that point.
How many people in the room have had experience with hoarding or seen it in one of their units or one of their deals? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Somewhere around 10, and we've got more than a third of the people in the room have had this experience. And for those who haven't, it could be coming your way.
Hopefully not. Count yourselves lucky that you haven't had to deal with it. So talking about disability and then reasonable accommodation. So disability, really good thing to remember. It's not always just physical. So it doesn't mean that you have to be in a wheelchair. There are a lot of mental disabilities that are equally recognized in fair housing. Outside of the definition here, who has dealt with a reasonable accommodation before, like an actual reasonable accommodation request that has been brought to you? Awesome. So that's great. I'm going to educate you guys kind of on what that process looks like. It's not super common, especially in single family rentals. We see it a ton in larger apartment rentals, but it's obviously because our tenant base is so much larger. So a reasonable accommodation is a change to a rule, policy, or practice that allows a person with a disability to participate equally. So we included a couple of photos here, but some of the most common examples are adding a bar in a bathroom because a resident or a tenant can't stand or sit down on the toilet properly. So they may ask you, hey, can you install that for me, or can I install it myself? There's an actual form that we'll get to here in a second that the proper way would be that they fill this out and give it to you as a landlord, and then you get to decide, is this a reasonable accommodation that we want to help make, or is it something that's not reasonable that we just don't agree with? All reasonable accommodation requests, if they are given to you in writing, they have to be reviewed, but not all of them have to be accepted. We will go over a couple of examples here on what that looks like. So when it comes to hoarding, because again, it is considered a disability if it's true hoarding, a reasonable accommodation that might be approved that you might get might be that they ask for a little more time. So we'll use a scenario. Let's say you go into an apartment or into your rental and you find the place is completely packed and you can't move around and you're worried about all the issues we talked about before, and you tell them, hey, we need to get this cleaned up. Let's say at that point, then they say, hey, I have a mental disability and I need time, or I need collaboration to help clean this area up. That's where you can brainstorm with them. Those two might be reasonable requests, and you say, sure, how much time do you need? Do you need 2 weeks? Do you need a month? If they're like, well, I need a year, okay, well, probably not. But if they're like, yeah, I think in 2 weeks I could get this completely cleaned up, great. As a landlord, that makes total sense to me that we're going to allow a little bit of time there. Again, a couple of excuses or accommodations that might not be approved is if they just say, hey, we just want you to look the other way. We're not going to clean it up. We don't want to, and we just want you to not worry about it. Well, no, we can't do that, right? We have to protect our properties and our rentals. So that's just not going to work. And again, you could deny the request at that point and you'd probably be totally fine. Or if the tenant says, hey, I'm not cleaning it. If you want to do it, you pay for it. Again, not your responsibility to clean up their mess. And so I think any attorney would likely say, hey, that's not a reasonable accommodation. You're willing to work with them as much as you can, but that is not reasonable. And that's when you could potentially move to a lease violation or an eviction if it absolutely got to that point. It is important to protect yourself. If they don't submit a form, but they call out that, hey, I have a disability and this is why I'm doing this, that is just as important as them actually giving you the form. And the form that we'll show you guys, it would actually be really beneficial for you to then take the form to the resident or the tenant and say, hey, fill this out for me, please, just so I have all of my T's crossed and I's dotted. We just want to make sure we're doing things right. And then that way you have the documentation in case they ever try to file a lawsuit against you. You can say, nope, look, we filled out the form. We have it in writing. You submitted this and that we had some conversation around it. When it comes to reasonable accommodations and disabilities, there's the apparent versus not apparent. An apparent disability would be somebody in a wheelchair, somebody that you can obviously tell they need that extra help. And a not apparent disability can usually be like of the mental state, or sometimes you might have a broken hip and they're just walking a little funny. There's those different types of disabilities there to be cautious of. If it is an apparent disability and they submit that request form, it's usually really easy to just say, hey, yeah, if you want to install grab bars, by all means do it. Because again, it's not going to cost much money. It's not going to cause any damage. Most rentals, you could leave it in there after. Where we're in apartments, it's a little different. We have to remove them so that each apartment looks the exact same. Whereas for single family rentals, you guys have a little more flexibility there. If the disability is not apparent and they didn't provide and they did not provide the proper documentation, but they're still asking for these requests, it's never a bad idea to consult with an attorney, somebody that is well-versed in tenant landlord law here in Idaho. Because again, it's just getting that second set of eyes on it. Again, not going to cost much money to get that opinion and make sure that you're covered. A little hard to see on the screen here, a little better here, but this is an example of reasonable accommodation form. I put the link down below. It's just idaholegalaid.org. You can also just find it by Googling reasonable accommodation form in Idaho. A couple of key pieces that are important. It says on here, so again, this would be from the tenant giving it to you. It says, I will provide a proof of need letter upon request. You may not inquire as to the nature or severity of my disability. very important that you're not picking up the phone and calling their doctor and saying, hey, I don't believe that this person actually has a disability. I think they're just dirty. Because you can absolutely get in a lot of trouble that way. I would say if they do go through all of the proper steps, they give you a doctor's letter that says they have a disability. From there, talk with them. Okay, how do we resolve this matter? Is it a little bit more extra time you need, or how can we help get this cleaned up so that it's not a structural issue or trip hazard or anything like that? And then another important piece is that there is a deadline on it. So again, if they submit this to you, you're going to want to make sure you're responding in the proper timeline. So another thing to remember, and this is a case study, a real life example I just had within the last couple of months at one of our properties. Hoarding comes in all shapes and sizes. The next photos you'll see between this one and a couple other are from somebody that was hoarding trash. But in most cases, it's items that they really care about. We've seen some where it's just piles and piles of CDs to where it's like a maze you're trying to get through the apartment. But in this specific one, it was trash. In this specific example, it was a little different than what we've been talking about, because if you can see here, this is all water. They actually forced a flood because their apartment was so dirty. They had stuff in their sink. They left it on they call it a slow drip. I think it was a little more than that. And they left out of town for a week. And because they had so much stuff in the sink, it clogged it, poured over, ended up causing a little over $40,000 worth of damages. In this specific case, we were able to tell them, hey, you have to clean this up and it has to be quick, because we're worried about mold growing under all this. We're worried about a few other things that, any other structural damage that could be happening from it. In this case, they were unable to clean it up, but they did tell us, hey, if you pay for somebody to clean it, we'll pay for it. So we brought in a company to do that. That was about $5,000 alone just to clear up all of their trash and everything. And then not counting the extra $35,000 in damages. So in this case, you'll see a few other pictures. Again, you can just see it, piled everywhere. In this case specifically, the resident was clean cut. Neighbors never reported a smell, which is astonishing after seeing all the photos. And the apartment was clean at our last annual inspection. So we do annual inspections once a year, but it was clean. We had no reason to suspect it, no complaints or anything that gave us a reason to go in there. However, since the resident never said anything about a disability, so this is kind of going on the flip side of everything we've been talking about, right? They didn't say anything about disability, therefore we just immediately proceeded with it as a sanitary issue and causing damage to the property. This is okay, absolutely okay, because that was never mentioned as a disability. And I wanted to make sure you understand that as landlords, that you can still hold a tenant accountable for sure. It's just when they throw in that disability piece, it becomes a little trickier and a little extra work that you might have to do. But in this case, we told them, you have 48 hours to basically, well, this was back when we were telling them they had to clean it. You had 48 hours to clean it up, or we're going to have to force you to move out. Our lease agreement allows for that, and we proceeded that way. If the tenant had asked for a reasonable accommodation, we still would have been able to hold them accountable, but it would have shifted the entire process. We probably would have gotten our attorneys involved much sooner to say, are we doing this the right way? Because obviously there's damage and we have to act fast because of the water and everything else. So we don't really have time for them to say, hey, I want an extra month to clean it up. We just can't. So how do we do that? And that's where we would have gotten the attorneys involved and approached it that way. Which would have been a little trickier. Before we move on to these other couple pieces, any questions initially on hoarding? How many of you are grateful you haven't had to deal with hoarding? Perfect. A couple of other pieces I just want to throw in the presentation, not pertaining to hoarding, but these are a few changes in Idaho law that we follow closely and actually helped get pushed through with the Idaho Apartment Association. These changes happened over the last 12 months. So there's a House Bill 545 that was pushed through. So if you weren't aware, back right around the time of COVID, it was around 2020, 2021, the city of Boise actually put a mandate in place that said they were capping application fees at $30, but you could only charge what you actually pay to screen them. So if you pay $12, you're supposed to only charge $12. They also capped how many applications you could receive on a rental at a time. This is just city of Boise, nowhere else in the state. And then they also said that every property can't dictate they can't discriminate, sorry, based on income or income type. So for example, Section 8 vouchers, previously, all of Idaho, we've been able to say, nope, we don't want to allow Section 8 vouchers if that's something that the landlord chooses. During that stint, the city of Boise put that into play to where you could not say that. If somebody came in with the voucher and they qualified versus all of your other your standards for screening, then you would have to accept it. Now, last year, they actually it went all the way up through the House to the Senate. Governor Little said, I think this is unjust. I don't want one county to be able to mandate and rent control and all these other things. They actually reverse all of that. So there are no longer any caps on application fees. You can technically go back to accepting as many applications on a rental as you want, although I wouldn't recommend going more than the one at a time, but you technically can. And this was a huge win for landlords, obviously, because for those that are from Idaho and know Idaho, we're the rogue state. We don't want those the rent controls and those protections. So very big win, and it was actually put into law, so it can't be changed at a future date. This is something that no city or municipality can mandate cap fees or rents or anything like that. That went into effect officially July 1st of last year, but it went way under the radar. Hardly anybody reported on it, so I wanted to make sure that everybody here was aware of that. And then the other one was the Senate Bill 1327. This is a big one that automatically seals new eviction records. So starting January 1st of this year, if a resident is evicted and they have no outstanding balances, so the case has been dismissed, they pay off anything that they owe to you, then that will be sealed after 3 years. They can file to have the eviction sealed, whereas before Idaho had no sealing at all. And if you were evicted once, it was on your record forever. We originally pushed for 5 to 7 years. And ultimately the state just kind of pushed back on that and said, hey, we still feel that's a little long. A lot can happen in 3 years to where a tenant can reform their life. And as long as they give you your money back and pay off everything, we feel that it's fair that it's 3 years. So that is where it landed on. That one just went into effect January of this year. And then just kind of in summary, thing to remember, fair housing can be tricky. It's one of the most important, if not the most important part of any landlord's responsibility. Disability and reasonable accommodation should be taken seriously. Obviously, the majority of the room has not seen them before. I do anticipate that the more people we have moving in from other states, we'll probably continue to see a bit of an uptick in those accommodations. Another one we didn't talk about that I know is a hot button, we had a picture on there, I just kind of skipped over it, is assistance animals. So if a resident comes in, that is the proper step. So that is one way where if they just come to you and they say, this is my ESA animal, you could give them that form, make them actually provide some type of verification from a healthcare provider, and then you may still have to accept it based on what they provide you. If you receive the reasonable accommodation request and you're not sure how to handle it, the best way is to consult with an attorney that specializes in Idaho landlord law, just to be safe. Again, it might cost you a couple $100, but it's probably worth it in the long run, versus a lawsuit that could cost you your place.
How do you end up going about it if the service dog ends up ruining your home? Like they poop, pee, destroy things.
You can still hold them fully accountable.
Oh, you can?
Yes, you can. Yep. So that's one great piece about Idaho is any damage caused. Obviously, it's all about documentation. So making sure you have the condition of the home documented beforehand, with photos, with move-in checklist, anything like that. And if they trash the place, you absolutely can.
Okay.
Yep.
Do you charge like a fee for rent fee for the service animal and the?
You cannot. No, any assistance animals at all, service animal, assistance animal, you can't charge any monthly pet rent. You can't charge pet fees up front, extra deposits, anything like that. Which is why it obviously is the bane of our existence as rental owners and managers. it's very frustrating. We understand, right? There's the disability piece that some people truly need them, but it unfortunately is the most abused system. There are some new companies out there coming into Boise now. We actually use it at most of our properties where they have to submit their document through, it's a company called Pet Screening. And Pet Screening actually runs everything on the back end and they verify, is this a fake letter? Is this something they just bought online? They have all these different lists of companies that sell letters, and there are some specifics where it's the healthcare physician that signs off on the letter has to be registered in the state of Idaho. And we saw for a long time online providers that were registered in Texas were signing off on these, and they've actually been able to go back and say, hey, this is not a valid letter, so you either need to provide a real letter or pay the pet fees to move in as a pet.
One thing to add to pet screening, they also require to have the letter renewed every single year.
Yes, which is a big piece, because a lot of times, especially as landlords have more and more units, you might forget, falls through the cracks. The pet screening company, they actually, make sure that they monitor it on an annual basis.
This is kind of like with pets, so like without pets as well.
Mhm.
If you live in like, or if you have a property rental in an HOA, and they end up having like a service pet or a pet, how does that work? If you end up getting like violations from HOA, like does that fall on you or does that fall on the?
My guess, that's actually a great question. I don't know much about HOA management.
I don't think an HOA can.
They would, I don't think they would for, for having the actual animal, I don't think they could. Now, if the animal was like abusing the common areas and, maybe the residents not picking up after them, they might be able to. And then I think,
They still be
Or like-
required to leash them and do.
right, they still have to follow the rules. So
Yeah.
if they didn't, my guess is that you would probably end up hearing from the HOA, but then you relay that down to the tenant in the form of a lease violation or regular conversation.
And that was another issue that we had because there are some breeds that insurance companies don't like. So what if you have someone with the pit bull breed and your insurance company won't cover pit bulls, so you're excluding pit bulls? You need your insurance for your mortgage, but then what if a pit bull comes in as an ESA? And I think that's one of those areas that you're just like, you want to avoid red tape when you can, and you're just basically entering a web of it.
Yeah.
And I don't know if anyone really has an answer for that one either.
I think if as long, that's where the documentation would really come in handy. If you had a reasonable accommodation form and you had, everything proper, they have a legitimate doctor's note and everything. I think you could provide that to the insurance company and say, hey, look, we said no pit bulls, but they have a true service animal or assistance animal. And we can't federally do anything about that. Like, we are held to the standards of the law.
That doesn't mean you gotta let them move a pony into your house.
Right.
Correct, reasonable, right? Exactly, reasonable, yeah. So that's a great call out. It's, there were people actually trying this, you probably saw the news stories on the airlines, people were trying to fly with their mini horses, and there are restrictions where you can absolutely say, hey, that doesn't quite qualify. Being in city limits, you can't have certain animals, farm animals and whatnot inside the house. So there are some things there. And even with assistance animals, if you get, let's say somebody comes to you and they say, hey, I have 4 separate dogs and 4 separate letters for each one. If certain counties and whatnot have restrictions on how many animals can even live inside one place. And so you can restrict based on that and tell them, hey, look, we would love to accept this, but our home just can't. So maybe we refund you your application fee. You move on, something like that. I saw a couple of
Have
answers.
you, I've heard this where the tenant has to list their pet on their renter's insurance. You guys do anything with that? Is that a thing?
We don't, I have heard that before, but I think it depends. It's probably more of a case by case. If you as a landlord want that way, I think you can request it. We don't require that. We just require property and liability insurance for each apartment.
Okay.
Yeah,
So you had mentioned you have your yearly inspection.
Mhm.
Is that typical in, obviously you can identify hoarders in that spot, but if you don't have that, or is that enough? What are ways to identify that you have hoarders in your property if you don't have that, or to find out sooner than your inspection or?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say when you have a individual unit or maybe a few units, it might be a little easier. With ours, that specific one is at a 300 unit property. So if we're just randomly selecting apartments to go into without reason, we get into some really gray water with fair housing on, are we targeting a specific resident? Now, let's say you just have one unit and you're like, I have a feeling, I've seen some stuff. You could absolutely say, hey, I'm gonna schedule quarterly inspections. Most lease agreements allow you to enter with a, 24 to 48 hour notice. Idaho kind of states 24, and then if your lease dictates otherwise, that's the only thing you'd want to look at. Our state's 48, so if we get a call from a resident that says, hey, I'm getting some really funky smells coming through the wall, I'd like you to come and take a look, then absolutely, we can go over into that person's apartment, and then we can be like, yep, we smell something weird, we want to serve a notice and go check this one out.
We typically recommend for our owners, at least 2 times a year.
Yeah.
Sometimes when they get college kids in their rentals and they find out about that, we usually tell them maybe bump that up to 3 times a year, or 4 times a year.
For sure, yeah.
Because you get around these college campuses with these dudes my age, 24, and I don't know, I'd want 4 of me. Like, sometimes depending on their values, and so you can up those inspections.
Yeah, it's mainly a time thing. So with my properties, a 300 unit property will take us 2 months, 3 weeks to 2 months, depending on how intensive the actual inspections are. We usually do our full inspection. So we'll do HVAC, and we'll do water heater inspections, all of that all at once, so that we're really not intruding too much on the resident. That's the other piece, is like with your tenants, if they're always paying on time and you have no reason to suspect them, yeah, maybe it's 2 times a year. But you don't want to be over there every month unless you have a reason to. And most property management companies won't have the time to do that either.
Yeah, there's usually like a good middle ground, because it can go into that, whether or not they want to lease from you.
Exactly.
Again, the next year, right? If they're always pestering me 4 times a year, they see how I'm living, like they're my babysitter. Well, it could be
That's why it's
a renter.
important to do your due diligence with rental references as well, because that stuff would probably pop up.
Oh, yeah, you had that experience just today.
The link says it all.
Yeah.
My daughter's actually renting a house with some roommates. It made me think about when you said it's near VSU. And her landlord had them take pictures and submit it to some type of a portal.
Mhm.
So they're not intruding on them that way, but they are getting to some type of a visual. To
Absolutely.
We do that too.
Yeah, that's a great way to do it too. Yeah, I'd say you still, depending on the situation, and the house and whatnot, you never know, like, are they just taking the good pictures? Yeah.
Just hide the whole inside
Right.
picture.
But if it's like, right, you can't hide hoarding, yeah. But if you're like, yeah, I want to do my one in-person inspection, and then maybe once or twice a year, you have them send some photos just to take care of it. A lot of it is the relationship too. If you're doing the renting yourself, you can build up that relationship with your renter, and a lot of times they'll be totally fine with you stopping by if they have nothing to hide. Then if they start hiding something, they're a little less likely to have you come by, and that's usually a sign to, do I need to pop over and, give them an inspection that, hey, I want to check something out, and you go and take a look.
How many renters or references do you usually get?
Normally, I'd say 2 to 3. Yeah, that would be my general rule of thumb. Depends on how long they've lived at each residence. So if the most recent they lived there for 10 years, they're probably only going to have that one, and that's probably good enough. But if they have bounced around a couple of times in the past few years, it's probably a good idea to check a few.
And whose contact info you can?
Normally the property manager, or if it's a single family, try to get the owner. They'll generally, the resident, the tenant might be able to give you that information. If not, you might have to do some detective work on Google and see what you can find.
And if they're giving it to owner, like if someone's self-managing, you might look up with city or county records and make sure they do indeed own that house.
Yeah. One thing that I would say, is if you're doing your own screening and your own background work, make sure you're doing it the same way for every single person. Again, when we're talking about fair housing and just covering our butts, the best way to do it. If you can say for every single person I call, the first 5 years of rental reference. So whether that's one person, whether it's four, that's how I do it. And then I check, obviously a background check and screening and all that. Because the last thing you want to do is say, this person looked a little sketchy, so I'm gonna run some extra checks on them. If they feel targeted in any way, and it turns into a lawsuit, and you don't have your ducks in a row, it's gonna be a lot harder to prove that you weren't targeting that person.
Is there a general application that you might use for screening?
Yeah, I believe on the apartment association website, the Idaho Apartment Association website, I think there's a template on there. We use the National Apartment Association lease and application. So ours is gonna be a little different because you have to actually pay for that one, but you can find a general application. If it's not on the Apartment Association website, there is an Idaho website that has, I just don't know. If you Google Idaho lease application, you'll be able to find one.
And the Idaho Apartment Association has all their forms. If you
Yeah.
want to just buy the package, you can buy the whole package from the IAA.
Oh, really? Okay. Yeah, we use a free one. It's called Shadow Trackers. And when we're just waiting for them to complete an application and they pay for it. And then we can see their data to see that information. But
Yeah, that's a good way to do it, definitely. When you're only dealing with a couple of rentals, it's a good way.
If you are doing inspections, to give them the notice,
Mhm.
do you have to post on their door? Can you send them an email? Can you shoot a text?
A great question. It depends on what your lease is. So Idaho statute is very loose in a lot of things. They do like posting, so a lot of things, if you look at like 3-day notices to pay rent and stuff in Idaho law, those do say they need to be posted and mailed. And but if your lease calls out that we can deliver a notice via email and the resident is receptive to that, then you could do it that way. Yeah, good questions. Anything else?
So when you list a property, right, because of the rent price nowadays, and if a couple of friends want to, group for them income together to rent,
Mhm.
do you have a legit way to deny them?
Typically, no. I would say it depends on the property. So in Idaho, they say 2 per bedroom plus 1 on the couch is kind of the general rule of thumb. So for a 3-bedroom, it's going to be 7 people. If they come in with up to 7 people, that's within the law. If it's any more than that, you can deny them, and that includes children and everything. But beyond that, you can't really just say, no, I don't want roommates. It gets really tricky. You technically can say it if you just have under 4 units. That's the way that Idaho law, it's really federal fair housing law says if you have less than 4 units, fair housing loosely applies to you, but it says we really discourage against that. It says treat everyone the same, do the policies properly. But I think if you had 1 unit and you were saying, I don't want roommates, I just want,
It's a family.
then you'd be discriminating against familial status, which is again,
But that
right in
doesn't
the
allow
gray
you,
area.
still doesn't allow you to break the HOA rule. So you got 7 adults, you can't have 7 cars parked in front of
Correct.
that house or on the
Exactly.
street.
Yes,
So you just have to be mindful of that.
exactly.
I have a thought and educate us on the legal. So our income requirement is 2 times.
Mhm.
Sometimes you could do 2 times per applicant, not per group together, correct?
Sure.
So that might be your way, is each person has to make 2 or 3 times the rent. You can't just pool together and that be.
As long as you're consistent with
With
your
that
rentals. So if you use that rule at all of your properties and every person that moves into that property, you could absolutely do it that way. It would be harder to find renters, I would say, because you're definitely escalating what income you're going to be seeing. In Idaho, obviously, we know is not super high income. That would be my only concern, is worrying about, are you actually going to get enough qualified renters to come through the door? Whereas if you had, maybe you have 3 roommates, they might be able to afford the 1850 that you were wanting to get on your Nampa property, versus, a single family maybe can't afford that at the moment.
Something that we're consistent with, I actually have that same scenario right now. We have a new CVH home that an investor brought to us. 3 or 4 college kids my age are wanting to rent it. And they're kind of wanting that family, right? That perfect family that rents your home. And so, well, I'm not going to deny them because I'm not willing to risk the lawsuit for fair housing, right? We are consistent always with at least a 600 credit score. And one of these applicants does not have at least a 600 credit score, but we're always consistent with it. We can prove it, right? So if you can find that something, those, 3 or 4 things you're always consistent with and you prove those, obviously correct me if I'm wrong. That's what we will be not denying them for. It's not because you're not a family. Well, this guy, sorry, he has a 575, right? We don't allow.
That's how.
Anyway,
Yeah.
Exactly.
And I think that's all the consistency talk, that's perfect, right? That's what we've been talking about with reasonable accommodations and everything. The more consistent you are, the more protected you are. So I would even write down what your screening standards are. So we don't approve anybody that has less than a 600 credit score. We require 2.5 times the rent for gross income. XYZ, no pets. You again might still have to accept assistance animals, but have all of that very clearly lined out. And then the important piece is to remember that if you have somebody that comes in that doesn't match that, just because maybe they look like the perfect tenant and you're like, oh man, I know they're going to be great. You can't make an exception. That's the hardest part, right? You've got to hold true to your standards in order to avoid any potential fair housing issue.
Based on like risk, have you, like in history, have you noticed it being more risky having just like a single family? Because there's a chance that only one person actually makes income versus having roommates where that's multiple incomes and people actually will pitch in and have that. Like, because like you said, Idaho doesn't make that good wage.
Yeah,
So it could be like more risky.
it could. Yeah, it's really hit or miss. I mean, that's, if anything in this industry for 10 years has taught me is never know what to expect. Like you're always gonna think you have the perfect tenant and then they trash the place, or you're thinking that this group of 4 college guys might trash the place and they take care of it better than anybody ever has. And so you don't know. And that's where it is hard, like as a landlord, right? Because you're taking a risk and it's your money on the line and it's your property on the line. But it's the risk you get into when you get into investment properties.
I did have a question, something that recently come up. I haven't done a ton of work with Section 8. It's not as popular where I was doing out in Idaho Falls before we bought these 2 franchises here. Just had a lady apply. She is using Section 8 StacyA, right? And her application looks good. We approved it, but we're still waiting on the home inspection, all that stuff that has to happen with Section 8. But we just got another set of applicants that we really like. Are we able to then go with those applicants because they can move on it quicker? Or you still have to move forward with Section 8?
You have to move forward with the Section 8 one. That is a big piece as to why a lot of landlords don't like working with Section 8, and why so many people in Boise were upset when that ordinance went into place, saying you had to allow it, because it's nothing against the people. It's the process is a pain. You have to go through all these hoops. They have to do this inspection. The inspection is dependent on an inspector that might take weeks. It might take days, but you never know. And then there's a lot of extra paperwork.
What about if they come to you with a ton of fixes? Because I've seen a couple, since I've only done a couple, that have been like these little nitty gritty things, right? Are you able to then move on because no, the owner's not willing to fix those things?
Not forcibly. You could give them the option and say, hey, the owner is not going to fix these things. Do you want to get a refund and move on? And if they say yes, then you would be in the clear. But if they say, no, we'll still take it, then you would have to, yeah.
I would even argue that your Section 8 renter, that situation, if you provide that you need to move in by this date, if they can't provide that, you can move on. And we've kind of been in that where you've got to move in by this date. You're not required to extend it for 6 weeks, waiting for a Section 8 inspector to come into that home and approve them and all that check process. If you've given them a move-in date, that's the contract.
That is a great call. So if you have already established the move-in date prior, like when you're showing the unit, you're like, the person has to move in, whoever applies has to move in by this date. You can hold true to that date.
Okay.
And when you're talking to Section 8, hey, this is the deadline we gave them. Can you make this happen or not? And I have had it where the tenant loses the apartment because Section 8 can't make it happen. But I would, usually they'll do everything they can to work with you. Just contact StacyA and say, hey, we're trying to get this done. We can't sit on this forever. Obviously, it's impacting the owner's financials. Like, we need to get somebody in. They'll generally work as quick as they can to get it done.
I think they're good to work with, it's just. Anything special isn't that stuff.
Yeah, once you get past the initial, I mean, Section 8 is 8 because they require their own inspections, not only at the beginning, but annually. And they can do random pop-ins just as a landlord can. And so usually the apartments are taken care of a little better. Usually, I've had it both ways.
We'll say Section 8 is definitely different location to location too.
Definitely, yeah.
In certain states, they're the best and certain.
Yeah, and I'd say even unfortunately Nampa to Boise, because SEEK is a lot smaller organization versus Boise City Ada County Housing Authority. You may have a completely different experience from Boise to Nampa. Yeah.
We kind of work with StacyA experience in general.
Good. Yeah. Yeah, and the overall takeaway from that one slide is that's up to you as landlords if you want to accept it. Again, there's plenty of perks to it, but there are a couple of hurdles you have to jump through initially. But if it's a qualified renter, as we've heard, like the market's not getting easier yet. You know, we anticipate it will get better. And we'll hear from CoStar next month. We work a lot with CoStar with Greystar. So I know there's a light at the end of the tunnel, right? We're on the upward trajectory over the next couple of years. It's just right this second. Sometimes you can't be picky with your renters. Sometimes you can. If you're in a hot spot and feel that you can, then by all means, like take the risk and try to get that extra $100 in rent. Because why not? You know, if you can try it for a couple weeks and see how it goes.
One last question about the SEEKA. So we require at least 3 times the monthly rent for income. And I just don't know exactly how to screen with a housing voucher like that. You know, how do you still make it so it's that fair housing, but obviously they're not going to meet that requirement even with that fair housing.
Right. Yeah, definitely does. We've battled the same thing. So how I do it is we try to get SEEKA to give you an estimate on how much they're going to cover. They won't tell you the exact amount because they always say we can't know until we certify it and we know the apartment's approved. But if they can give you an estimate, we believe we're going to be able to cover 75% of their rent. Take that amount and apply that to, like, add that onto their any income they already have. And then you would use that. If that meets the 3 times, great. If it doesn't, you can deny based on that. Yeah.
Follow-up question on the rental.
If they provide you a number, how do you make sure they are the right people?
Great question. It's hard. You don't know for sure. You have to do what you can, but ultimately, if it's their best friend saying that they're the CEO of, you know, a small management company, you can't do anything about it. I wish I had a better answer for that, but I've dealt with that. I'm like, I don't think this is a company that I'm talking to, but it's very hard to prove otherwise. Am I at time?
Well, any other questions? Because we can do some chatting afterwards as well. All right, well then in that case, I'm gonna come up and join you.
Okay.
AVID Investors, Alex Costa with Greystar, come on over here. Thank you. Pardon me. Thank you, Alex. That was amazing. There we go. All right. AVID, we have questions up here. Oh, good. Bobby asked, what is the anticipated influence on the rental market due to California fires?
That's a great question.
California fires, how are they going to influence the rental market? Will they open back up the floodgates to Idaho like the last time they couldn't breathe over there, but it was also during COVID?
I think it's definitely reasonable. This is just speculation, just based on what we know, but I would say it's absolutely reasonable to expect it, knowing that the specific areas that the fires were definitely, you know, higher income areas, little nicer houses. They could absolutely come here if they get the proper insurance settlements. That's going to be the big question mark. I don't think it's going to be tomorrow because we know those types of things take time. The $770 that Biden gave everyone's not gonna cut it. So I would anticipate we probably will, but I don't think it's gonna be today. I think it's probably going to be more in the next 6 to 12 months that we might start seeing that, depending on how that situation plays out.
Okay, one step this way for me, Alex. Alex Costa of Greystar, thank you so much for
Thank you.
unveiling the H word. Hoarding. It's real, it's out there, and I noted down that it is definitely a fair housing issue, so it's something you want to pay attention to. Why? Because it's considered a mental disability, and mental disabilities are protected by fair housing rules. However, preventing dangerous and unsanitary conditions is a landlord responsibility. So here are some do's and don'ts that Alex helped us suss out tonight. Do consider or make reasonable accommodations when requested by tenants. You don't have to always pay for 100% of those, but you want to consider them and respond to that request. Do recall that not all disabilities are apparent. Do protect yourself from liability from unhealthy living conditions, and consider engaging an attorney or treading very carefully if a hoarder discloses that they have a disability, or if any tenant discloses that there's a disability that's impacting how you can handle your property. But the don'ts: don't discriminate. Don't treat individual people differently. Don't inquire into the nature or severity of a disability, and don't ignore a reasonable request for accommodation. So just like when we see some darkening or staining or biogrowth, we don't just call it the M word, black mold. We refer to it as darkening or staining. You don't have to automatically jump to the H word and call it hoarding, because there are other things you can put into that notice, into your lease violation, that oftentimes go along with hoarding that aren't going to be such a sensitive word that tiptoes on fair housing. And those are sanitation issues, pests, and unsafe living conditions.
Fire safety.
Thank you, Avid Investors.
I have a question.
Thank you, Alex Costa. We're going to clap.